Melissa Ramkumarsingh, our Senior Capacity Development Specialist, and Stacia Mahabir, my Executive Assistant. So over to you, Melissa.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Laljan. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, please allow me to go through some helpful tips for a successful session. But Mr. Laljan would have said the mic would be muted, so during the session, you can send your questions via the chat, and this will be addressed at the end of the session. Note also that the session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared after the session. The presentation will also be uploaded on the OPR's website. So without further delay, let's get started. Our agenda this morning includes 3 items. Firstly, we would go through the establishment and role of the Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee, or PDAC. Then we will explore the role of PDAC to understand what it entails. And finally, we would provide some highlight of the public procurement and disposal of public property regulations. The establishment of the Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee, or PDAC, is a requirement of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property, Procurement Methods and Procedures Regulations 2021. In this section of the presentation, we will explore what the regulation outlines as it relates to the composition and role of PDAC. Part 9, Regulation 21 of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property, Procurement Methods and Procedures Regulations 2021 outlines the requirements for the establishment of PDAC. Regulation 21, subsection 1, states that a procuring entity shall establish a procurement and disposal advisory committee, and as we know in legal terms, the word shall illustrates a compulsory requirement. Regulation 21, subsection 2, then provides the composition of PDAC. This includes the corporate secretary or head of legal, the head of finance, a subject matter expert, and such other members as may be necessary. Subsection 3 stipulates that a member of PDAC may be sourced from another public body. This may be useful in circumstances where a public body does not have the required subject matter expertise. Regulation 21, subsection 4 goes on to state that a senior officer shall be appointed as the secretary to attend all meetings of the committee, but shall not be a member of the committee. This secretary plays a key role in ensuring effective administration, record keeping, management, as well as governance within the committee. Regulation 21, subsection 5 is the core which outlines the role of PDAC. It states that the committee shall review reports, recommendations for contract award, and procurement proceedings and property disposal files to determine whether there was A, adherence to the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015 as amended, and the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Regulations 2021. These form the legal and regulatory framework for public procurement in Trinidad and Tobago. B, requires adherence to the handbooks and guidelines. These handbooks and guidelines referred to were developed by the OPR. They outline the policy framework for achieving the objects of the Act and for compliance with the regulations. These documents are available on the resource section of the OPR's website. So the THA can adopt, amend these handbooks, or based on your unique circumstances, you can develop your own special guidelines and handbooks for the approval of the OPR. Regardless of the option selected, that is whether you adopt, amend, or develop your own handbooks, the selected handbooks and guidelines must be submitted to the OPR for approval. And once approved, all procurement and disposal actions executed by the THA must be in accordance with the THA's approved handbooks and guidelines, and PDAC has a critical role in ensuring this. C. Adherence to the approved procurement or disposal strategy. The procurement or disposal strategy, whichever is relevant in the circumstance, is developed before a procurement or disposal is executed. It outlines the analysis undertaken for the specific good being procured or disposed of, and outlines the most suitable procurement or disposal approach to achieve the planned outcomes of the procurement or disposal activity. PDAC's review must ensure that the approved procurement strategy was followed and material adjustments have been documented. And D, achievement of the objects of the Act, which, as you know, include accountability, integrity, transparency, value for money, efficiency, fairness, equity, public confidence, local industry development, sustainable procurement, and sustainable development. So by doing this verification, PDAC provides an added level of assurance to the accounting officer for the THA. After reviewing the relevant reports, recommendations, procurement proceedings, and property disposal files in keeping with Regulation 21 subsection 5, which I just outlined, PDAC is required to undertake the appropriate action outlined on the slide. Firstly, if PDAC is of the opinion that any aspect of Sub-Regulation 5 has not been complied with or adhered to, PDAC shall recommend the appropriate action to the procurement officer in writing with an explanation of the reasons for its decision. According to Regulation 21, Subregulation 7, the written recommendation and explanation of PDAC must also be forwarded to the accounting officer for noting. On the other hand, where there is agreement, PDAC is required to provide the accounting officer with a written recommendation which must be accompanied by the procurement proceedings file and the property disposal file. Now, to ensure that there is integrity and objectivity in the execution of PDAC's role, and to ensure that the recommendations are made are free from bias or perceived bias, Regulation 21, subsection 9, requires that a member of the committee, meaning PDAC, shall disclose his interests and not take part in the proceedings of the committee where he is a member, director, or shareholder of a company or other body corporate, is a proprietor or partner in a firm or partnership, is employed by or is otherwise a party to a contract for services, has a financial interest in or relationship with someone, is a relative of an individual being reviewed by the committee. So in summary, this diagram illustrates the different levels of review and approval in the procurement and disposal process and how PDAC fits into this process. At the first level, we have the disposal committee and the evaluation committee. The role of the disposal committee is to recommend the best method of disposing of unserviceable, obsolete, or surplus stores or equipment. According to Section 55 of the Act, the disposal committee must comprise no less than 3 persons. As the diagram illustrates, this committee can comprise the asset manager or officer, the inventory officer, or procurement delegate, and a subject matter expert or technical expert. On the other hand, we have the evaluation committee. The evaluation committee would review submissions received in response to a solicitation and assess them against the criteria outlined in the solicitation document and make a recommendation. The evaluation committee should include, at a minimum, a procurement representative, a representative of the legal department, and a representative of the user department. Following their review, the recommendation of the evaluation committee and the disposal committee must be submitted to the named procurement officer or NPO, who will review, and once there is agreement, the procurement or disposal file, including all the relevant details, will be submitted to PDAC for review. PDAC will then review the procurement and property disposal file in accordance with Regulation 21, subsection 5, outlined previously, and make a recommendation. In the case of non-compliance, PDAC will recommend the appropriate action to the procurement officer in writing, providing the reasons for its decision. This explanation will also be sent to the accounting officer for noting. When the accounting officer receives the recommendations, he or she will review and accept or reject. In the case of a disposal action, the accounting officer must provide a written notice of his or her decision to accept or reject the decision of the disposal committee within 14 days of receipt. In the case of a rejection also, the reasons must be provided in writing. The accounting officer must consult with the line minister and determine how the item is to be disposed of. The OPR must be provided with a copy of the notice of rejection of the disposal decision and the reasons for the rejection. In the case of procurement, if the accounting officer rejects the recommendation of the evaluation committee and PDAC, the reasons must also be provided in writing to the NPO in the procurement proceedings file. Any supporting information, as well as any request that the issue be addressed by the evaluation committee, should also be included in the procurement file. On the other hand, if the accounting officer accepts the procurement or disposal decision, the decision is executed. Of note, in instances where a public body is governed by a board of directors, the accounting officer may submit the decision to the board for non-objection. In circumstances where the board objects, the reasons must also be provided in writing for consideration by the accounting officer. However, the final decision rests with the accounting officer. So let's now take a look at some additional elements of PDAC's role. One of the key aspects of PDAC's role is reviewing the report and recommendation for contract award. PDAC should note that the evaluation report must clearly document the procurement process, providing a clear and documented audit trail of all decisions taken and the reasons for them. The contents of the evaluation report should include the introduction, which should provide a brief explanation of the reason for the procurement, the objects of the act that the procuring entity set out to achieve, and a brief description of the project. The background should provide details on how the project was initiated, any prior approval that was granted, the procurement method used, the submission deadline, the firm submitting bids, and the tender opening procedure. The evaluation of bid section should include a detailed description of the evaluation process, the evaluation method applied, and the bids that were screened or shortlisted for further assessment. It should also include a summary of the bids received, the strengths and weaknesses as well as copies of the requested documentation, any amendments or clarifications issued, a detailed evaluation of each bid against the evaluation criteria, and the results of the comparative assessment of the bids. The recommendation for award of contract section should provide an overview of the completed evaluation with justified ranking of the bids received and a recommendation for the selection of a supplier or contractor. If it is not possible to recommend a preferred supplier or contractor, the evaluation report should make a recommendation on how to proceed. Additionally, the evaluation report should be signed by the evaluation committee and approved by the designated approver based on the THA's approved delegation of authority. When reviewing the evaluation report, PDAC must ensure that the bid recommended in the evaluation process and report best satisfied the requirements of the THA while also ensuring compliance with the objects of the Act. In keeping with Section Regulation 3.1 of the Evaluation Regulations, PDAC must ensure that the successful submission was selected based on the evaluation criteria and methodology specified in the bidding document. Under no circumstances should selection be based on new or revised evaluation criteria that were introduced during the evaluation process and were not made known in advance in the solicitation documents. Additionally, in keeping with Regulation 3.2 of the Evaluation Regulations, PDAC must verify that a procuring entity's evaluation criteria and complexity of goods, works, and or services being procured. The evaluation criteria and methodology were appropriate to the type, nature, market conditions, and complexity of the goods, works, or services being procured. This can be assessed by reviewing the procurement strategy development form, which justifies the reason for selecting the procurement approach and ensuring compliance with same. So this slide summarizes some key points to ensure adherence to the objects of the Act when reviewing the evaluation reports. As mentioned previously, the award decision must be objective and based on the criteria that has been disclosed in the solicitation document. PDAC should ensure that the decision-making process was fair and that no conflict of interest existed. The process executed was transparent and that value for money and the other objectives identified as part of the process were achieved. For PDAC to make a determination on compliance in keeping with its role, public bodies must ensure that the basis of all procurement or disposal decisions are clearly documented and placed on the procurement file. In this regard, Regulation 4, subsections A to O of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Record of Procurement Proceedings 2021 regulations require that a record shall contain the original and a copy of the information, document, and communication related to the procurement proceeding, including but not limited to the document indicating approval to execute the various stages of the procurement proceeding. So this is the approval to expend resources or public funds to procure particular items, the complete bidding document inclusive of appendices and amendments, a description of the object of the procurement, a list of each participating supplier or contractor and the qualifications of the supplier or contractor, the reason for limiting participation where participation is limited. Regulation 4 also states that the content of the record should include any request for clarification and the responses received from suppliers or contractors in response to the request, the reason for cancellation of bids where bids are cancelled, a statement of the reason for choice of the procurement method, and this would be included in your procurement strategy development form, the tender price, a summary of the evaluation of submissions, including the reasons for the rejection of an abnormally low bid, and this should be included in your evaluation report. A decision to conduct a procurement without a standstill period and the reason for the decision. This as well should be included in your procurement strategy form. A decision to suspend a standstill period, the signed contract, a decision of the office pursuant to its review and the reasons for the decision, and such other information required by the office. Let us now look at some highlights of the public procurement and disposal of public property regulations. So as mentioned previously, PDAC must ensure adherence to the public procurement and disposal of public property regulations, which comprise 10 individual regulations, which are intended to operationalize the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. These regulations were approved in the House of Representatives on the 14th of January 2022 and in the Senate on the 8th of February 2022. We will go through the highlights of these, but all 10 documents can be accessed on the OPR's website. The participation in procurement regulation stipulates the requirement for participation in procurement proceedings and consists of domestic preference, margin of domestic preference, participation of joint ventures and other consortia, and information on the procurement depository. The pre-qualification and pre-selection regulations outline clarification of pre-qualification documents, invitation for pre-selection, assessment for pre-selection, and the pre-selection scoring criteria. The procurement methods and procedures regulations addresses strategic procurement, thresholds. It identifies open bidding as the default method, and it outlines additional procurement methods and the circumstances for their use. These include limited bidding, requests for quotations, single source selection and the related procedures, framework agreements, and electronic reverse auctions. This regulation also covers regulations in relation to the Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee and emphasizes the importance of technical specifications in the procurement process. The evaluation regulations provide details on the evaluation criteria, price factors such as payment terms, warranties, and after-sales services, non-price factors such as the quality of methodology and work plan, and the standstill period. The procurement of consultants regulations provide brief details on the submission of proposals and evaluation procedures that may be applied. The record of procurement proceedings regulation outline the requirement to maintain easily accessible and retrievable records and the contents of these records, which we went through earlier, and the reporting requirements. The retention of public property and disposal of personal property regulations outline general procedures for the disposal of personal property. It includes risk-based approach to retention of public property and steps that must be taken when disposing to public employees. The challenge proceedings regulations outline the procedure for review. The ineligibility proceedings regulations outline aspects of an ineligibility proceedings such as hearings and evidence, as well as ineligibility sanction. And finally, the miscellaneous regulations outline the requirements for the appointment of committee members. As mentioned previously, PDAC is also required to ensure adherence to the approved handbooks and guidelines which have been adopted, adapted, or developed by the THA and approved by the OPR. This slide outlines the procurement house, which you will see when you visit the OPR's website. It details the handbooks and guidelines that have been developed by the OPR, as well as some work in progress documents which are expected to be uploaded onto the website. Overarching documents are included in the rooftop and foundation of the house, and each pillar represents a stage of the procurement and disposal process. For more information, you can access these documents on the Resources tab of the OPR's website. So we have reached the end of today's presentation and will now invite you to ask any questions that you may